Okay, I think we will begin. Kwei, bonjour, hello. My name is Anna Bogic, and on behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies, CIPS, and the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa, I would like to welcome you all to today's panel and book launch entitled Cross-Border Solidarities in 21st Century Context, Feminist Perspectives and Activist Practices. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa is located on the unceded Algonquin lands. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. Moderating the panel today will be Dr. Pascale Dufour, who is full professor at the University of Montreal in the Political Science Department. She directs the research team on democracy and political action, and she has published many articles and several books on the World March of Women, on the transnationalization of solidarities and other topics. And I will give the floor to Professor Pascale Dufour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning to all. I'm Pascale Dufour, one of the co-author of this wonderful book, n'est-ce pas? And I will chair the launch. So I'm very pleased to be here today, especially as this launch marks also the end of a very long research project that we have had been carrying out with Janet Conway. You will hear her in a moment, and Dominique Masson, and during which we have enjoyed very much working together and had fun. First, I give you some technical information for the audience and the panelists. So it is possible to put your question in the Q&A when you want, and we will take questions after each section of the book. During the presentation, there will be 3 of them. I will select a number of questions to be put to each panel. Each speaker can choose what to respond to and is given 1 or 2 minutes to respond. At the very end of the event, we hope to have about 50 minutes to direct more questions to all the panelists. So we should end around 12:30 approximately. So the order for the speaker first, and for the first section of the book, Janet Conway for the book project and introduction for 15 minutes. And then the first section of the book with Ioana Sirtosea, Agnes Chetai, and then I will take some questions if there are some in the chat. So Janet, I will leave you the floor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Pascale. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, from the traditional territories of numerous Indigenous peoples, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and home to many other Indigenous peoples today. My task is twofold. It's to give you some sense of the history of this book, where it came from, and also to give you a sense of our co-authored introduction in the book and how we set up the agenda of the book. So to start with, as Pascale mentioned, Pascale and Dominique Masson and I have been part of this long-term relationship working on solidarity building in transnational feminist networks since 2013. We inaugurated a project with attention to the World March of Women as our primary kind of site of study. The World March of Women is the largest transnational feminist network in the world, and it's present in about 60 countries, active in 60 countries at the time of our study. And we set out to study solidarity building, and we chose in particular to focus on solidarity building around food sovereignty. And this was an interesting choice, an important choice, because food has not really been central to a lot of feminist politics, and certainly not to the study of solidarity building among feminists. And it introduced a number of conundrums and challenges and new questions in terms of solidarity building. In particular, the work of building solidarity with non-feminist movements. So feminist work of solidarity building with non-feminist movements, and particularly with mixed gender movements and peasant and indigenous movements, who are the kind of primary actors in food sovereignty politics. Over these many years now of working on this project, we've had the pleasure of working with other scholars who have also been working on the World March of Women, among them Nathalie Lebon, who's one of our contributors, and also with a number of fantastic students, including Annabelle Paulus, Elsa Beaulieu, Carmen Diaz-Alba, and Khalil Habri. And we thank them for their work, and it's been such a great pleasure to work with them. And their contributions are also reflected in the chapters of the book. In December 2018, as we were well into our project, we decided to convoke an international symposium on the subject of cross-border solidarities at the University of Ottawa. And we did this really to try to broaden the conversation and to bring our work into conversation with other scholars who were seeking to work on cross-border solidarities, but in ways that were clearly empirically anchored in activist practices. And this we see as one of the great contributions of this book, is that we are exploring how solidarities are understood and actively constructed in messy practices in situ, in social movements and activist spaces. We also asked our contributors to consider the power and potential of feminist analytics in studying cross-border solidarities. And we proposed intersectionality and transnational feminism as particularly relevant traditions of feminist study that we wanted to bring to bear on the study of cross-border solidarities. So that symposium in December of 2018 has resulted now in this beautiful book that we are launching today, and that we are so happy that you've joined us to celebrate this. And also, of course, it's given us another excuse to convene our contributors. So now let me turn briefly to introducing our introduction. So the introduction to the book is co-authored by myself, Pascale, Dominique, Masson, and Khalil Habri. And in the introduction, we basically outline what we confronted as the problem of studying solidarity. So in terms of the social movements that we are part of and that we're studying, as well as the literature on those kinds of social movements, solidarity is largely taken for granted. It's taken for granted as a value of social justice movements and as a virtue. It's not something that is itself problematized for study. It's often equated with the fact of collaboration across difference, or coalition building, or transnationalization. It's equated with those kinds of practices. The scholarship that focuses more properly on solidarity as a kind of object of study and theorizing tends to be in moral philosophy. It's a normative discourse, it's universalizing, and it's not very anchored in, or anchored at all in, activist practices. In our inquiry, we really work very committed to trying to anchor this study in activist practice, and in fact, to problematize solidarity as variable, contradictory, and contingent, and to explore also how solidarity is riven through with power relations, including within social justice movements and communities. We were relying heavily on scholarship in the capacious body of scholarship known as transnational feminism. And this body of scholarship had really inspired our inquiry into solidarity building. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But we found, as we struggled to both make sense of the practices that we saw in the World March of Women, and also as our contributors were studying in terms of grounded practices of solidarity building in activist communities, that transnational feminism also proved to be quite limited and problematic for our purposes. So our introduction to the book lays out some of those scholarly contexts and conundrums in studying solidarity. So what we do in the introduction is set out to outline a critical genealogy of notions of solidarity, and in particular, to locate and problematize solidarity within Eurocentric modernity, recognizing that our ideas of solidarity and traditions of thinking about solidarity have come out of the European tradition, out of Euro-modernist thought. So in particular, we set out to study that and to say that and to observe that over the long 19th century, solidarity took shape as a political value and virtue in the context of industrial upheavals in Europe. And different strands of solidarity were identified and named and theorized, such as human, civic, and social solidarity. And these really functioned in the context of those industrial upheavals to reaffirm and reassert social cohesion, social order, social harmony. And we're really operating at the service of consolidating modern European nation states. Now, Marxist deployments of solidarity building, of course, are premised not on social cohesion, but on social conflict in the context of class struggle against capitalist social relations. And so Marxist deployments of solidarity introduce a very important concept for us, which is that solidarity is a praxis. It is something to be constructed. And in Marxist traditions of solidarity, solidarity is understood as building counter-hegemony against capitalist elites. All of these conceptions of solidarity are anchored, however, in Euro-modernist thought, and in fact, in Eurocentric thought. They take shape at the height of European imperialism as intra-European discourses, without reference to how European colonial adventures affect how these things are being thought of and constructed within Europe. All invocations of solidarity draw boundaries around political community, around who should be the subjects and recipients or participants in solidarity relations. So invocations of solidarity always affect bounded political communities. And we argue in the introduction that all these traditions of solidarity, including emancipatory solidarity, are marked by this Euro-modernist context at the height of European imperialism and reinscribe notions of political community that are bounded in particularly Eurocentric ways, that are gendered and racialized and reinforce Eurocentrism and a Eurocentric understanding of political community. We call on the work of Juliet Hooker, who talks about solidarity as a racial concept, the racialization of solidarity, that it relies on a social ontology of race, that solidarity is a white concept. And in fact, we can see this operating in such graphic terms right now at the Ukrainian border, when solidarity is being extended in these extraordinary ways toward Ukrainians as white Europeans, at the same time as, Black and South Asian residents in the Ukraine are being turned away from Polish borders. We can see this in the outpouring of solidarity from Canadians toward Ukrainians in a way that was not at all present in the treatment of Syrian and Afghan refugees. So it's a very graphic example of how solidarity is a racial concept. So we build on this kind of work to problematize this kind of Euro-modernist tradition of talking about solidarity. Now, transnational feminism is a very important counter-discourse of solidarity because it, of course, emerged as a critique of Western feminist notions of solidarity that were also marked by that Euro-modernist tradition of thinking about political community. And transnational feminism, in contrast to those Euro-modernist traditions, centers difference in its construction of solidarity, and especially attends to racialized and spatialized difference in the context of histories and legacies of colonialism. So transnational feminism helps us think about solidarities in intersectional terms, especially attending to racialization and gendered power dynamics. So, and racialized gender, the intersection of race and gender. very importantly also, transnational feminism provides us with a thoroughgoing critique of Euromodernity, especially in relationship to the establishment of European nation states and the nation state itself a modernist construct and modern political communities in that sense. So it provides us with very important resources in terms of problematizing Euro-modern conceptions of solidarity and bringing those to bear on our study of solidarity building in activist sites in different parts of the world today. Now, transnational feminist understandings of solidarity provide a very important counterpoint and a rupture in terms of the Euro-modernist tradition, but we still found that transnational feminist conceptions of solidarity remained normative, in that they were not adequately or in a thoroughgoing way grounded in messy activist practices. And so we found that although the discourse of transnational feminism remains really inspiring and important, and it raises very important critiques and alternatives, it's limited in its normativity. In the introduction, we then turn to our study of the World March of Women and how the World March, and looking at its concrete practices of solidarity building, challenges also transnational feminism. And it does so in several interesting ways. In some respects, the World March of Women actually in its practice represents the best of solidarity building as imagined by transnational feminism. But it also presented us with real contradictions, such as the absence of a discourse of race, which we found puzzling, an absence of explicitly kind of anti-colonial discourse, also puzzling, an absence of a critique of the nation state, puzzling. In fact, when we struggled to try to make sense of this, it began to make more sense when we realized that the World March of Women actually was an example of new solidarities on the global left that were reprising emancipatory solidarities and were reprising earlier traditions of socialist feminism and feminist internationalism that kind of had been eschewed by transnational feminism. So this presented us with a challenge in terms of how to make sense of the new practices and new sensibilities that we saw in a network like the World March of Women, but yet its mismatch with the critical discourses and visions of solidarity as presented in transnational feminism. In the introduction, we turn to post-socialist feminist critiques of transnational feminism to help make sense of this, and in which they argue that transnational feminism, as important as that critique is and remains, also elides other forms of feminist internationalism in the context of the Cold War. And a number of our contributors actually explore this and explore the legacies of the Cold War in terms of how transnational feminism has taken shape and its notion of solidarity building and how it's been affected by that. So again, we see this as a real unique contribution of our book. Okay, and there's my timer. So in my last 30 seconds, I'm just going to say that at the end of the introduction, thinking about the solidarities that we have seen enacted by the World March of Women and other such actors on the global left, we propose that there are at least 3 modalities of solidarity that we can see at work on the global left. They include counter-hegemonic solidarities inspired by Marxist traditions. They include intersectional feminist solidarities as inspired by transnational feminism, and they also include pluriversal solidarities. And these are solidarities that are emerging in the context of an international resurgent indigenous movements in terms of their relations with each other and with non-indigenous movements, in which there's a recognition that actually we need to build solidarity across worlds, across different worlds. And this raises the problematic of translation, which is another major problematic and theme that some of our contributors develop and which we consider also a major innovative contribution of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janet. So I give the floor to Ioana Sirstosea for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Hello, and thank you for being here today. And I would also like to warmly thank the organizers of the encounter for putting us together in this wonderful collective journey in which I was very happy to participate. My chapter takes a historical stance and deals with the making of global feminism as a transnational solidarity project in the context of the late Cold War. A large amount of scholarship published since the late 1990s considers feminist transnational mobilizations and progress in women's rights international law related to United Nations action since the mid-70s. Such action includes the declaration by the UN of the International Women's Year in 1975 and of the subsequent Decade for Women, together with the organizing of 4 World Women's Conferences, of which the last one took place in Beijing in 1995. A Handbook of Transnational Feminist Movements was published in 2015 in celebration of these accomplishments. In its turn, the UN website endorses the success story of global feminism, dating its birth at the Nairobi Conference in 1985, after 2 earlier encounters deeply marked by dissent. The last 10 to 12 years also gave way to research making clear that gender ideologies, gender issues, and the very political definition of women's rights were in fact a central battlefield in the Cold War competition. Indeed, socialist states promoted women's rights within a wider social and economic justice framework, while the liberal ones focused on individual rights and freedoms. This implies that the process of globalization of women's movements and gender equality norms during the time lapse between the International Women's Year and the Beijing Conference might have been contested and non-linear. This chapter gives a glimpse of the main questions and preliminary findings of my research program in progress. Its main focus is on the social identity of people involved in building transnational feminist networks in the late Cold War, on the resources that made their work possible, and on their vision of cross-border solidarity. I am interested in understanding whether and how the end of the bipolar world impacted feminist networks established around the UN venues during the time span under consideration. While studying in a recent book the integration of women from the former Eastern European bloc in the realm of global feminism, I have discovered that post-socialist actors had criticized the Beijing conference agenda and the outcoming documents for overlooking their specific historically built realities. The analysis I developed in the chapter builds on sources related to major events, actors, and projects commonly associated with building the global as a scale and the political imaginary for feminist activism. This allowed me to stress the fact that not only activist work, but also wider geopolitical aims of donors shaped transnational networking and activism based on a liberal agenda internationally promoted as universal. To conclude, I think it is important to read this chapter for basically 2 interrelated reasons. The first one is that it provides a refreshing view on how a consensus was proclaimed in Beijing, which privileges concepts such as women's human rights, the empowerment of women, and gender mainstreaming. Indeed, these concepts emerge from a history marked by many tensions, ideological division, and unequal power, which is the very opposite of a spontaneous or natural process of globalizing activist concerns. As hegemony building is a challenging object for sociological inquiry, the second reason for reading the chapter is a methodological one. This work invites further reflection on the archives, the toolbox, and the intellectual operations needed for the study of transnational activism in a given time and space. Thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry if it was too fast. I did time myself, but I was a little bit tense. Now, thank you. Thank you again.
Merci, Yona. I have to say before giving the floor to Agnès Chetay that the contributors of the volume had a very difficult duty to done today, resuming and their chapter in 5 minutes. So I understand. So Agnès.
Hi. Thank you very much, Pascale, and I want to thank also Janet and Dominique for putting this wonderful project together. I'm happy to be here today, and I will do my best with the 5 minutes. I use this chapter as an opportunity to look back at years of ethnographic fieldwork that I did with Polish LGBTI organizations and the transnational networks that they were part of. So I especially focused here on a wave of transnational solidarity that happened in the middle of the years 2000 with Polish, then lesbian and gay organizations, because it was just before the trans issues and intersex issues were included in the movement. The questions I asked about these experiences of cooperation between Western European and Polish organizations were: who initiated contact and why? Who was able to choose their partner? Who was in a position to define the focus of the collaborations and or the larger political project? And finally, what kind of knowledge was produced as a result of these encounters? To answer these questions, I presented two interrelated but very different cases of transnational collaboration that happened around the same years, roughly 15 years ago, between the Polish movement and Western European organizations. One was involving the central board of a Polish organization that was based in a capital and close to the centers of political power, and an umbrella transnational advocacy network active in Europe. This collaboration was vertical in structure and oriented towards liberal, rights-based advocacy type of activism. The other case involved a local group based in the city of Krakow, organizing a cultural festival, and a range of different German, Belgian, and French collectives and organizations who mobilized in solidarity with this festival. It was a loose, horizontally structured network, and it involved actors with different political orientations, including some rooted in radical, queer, intersectional activism. These two cases allow me to draw the picture of a multi-level, complex landscape from local to domestic to transnational, and with involving very different types of actors. What I show in my chapter is that across the cases, and despite all these important differences, somewhat similar relations occurred between Western European partners and their Polish counterparts. The Western European actors were always the ones to initiate collaboration, and they expected to pick and choose their Polish partners according to their ideological or organizational preferences, as if on the market of solidarity. I also use these cases to question the notion of solidarity, using the distinction made by Ivana Etelovich and Jackie Smith between altruistic solidarity and political solidarity. I show that both cases actually present elements of both types of solidarity. The goal is both to support the Polish movement, especially against its local and global opponents, and to address larger issues that connect different contexts across Europe, such as the role of the European Union. However, I also show that the larger political projects are always formulated and put forward by Western European actors, not by the Polish ones, and that their presence, the presence of these projects, does not ensure to avoid West-East inequalities in the networks. Finally, I show in the chapter that Western European actors, as a result of these collaborations, produced knowledge about the situation in Poland along their own standards, and often reproducing a Western gaze on Polish reality, especially putting emphasis on religiosity and homophobia and violence associated to the idea of backwardness. So that is for the summary of my chapter that focuses on a very specific moment, and that this moment in the middle of the years 2000 shows the phenomena of West-East inequalities and difference being reproduced in progressive politics networks very clearly. To open up, I want to emphasize that these dynamics change through time, And they certainly did in networks of solidarity with Poland since then, but that they can be easily reactivated, as it is the case whenever homophobic heteronationalist politics are coming back strong in Poland. And we could see that last year, for example. And maybe it is particularly important to be aware and careful about the existence of these West-East dynamics today in the context of solidarity with Ukraine under Russian war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Una. No, I can take some question if you have some. I don't see any in the Q&A, but we can take like 1-2 minutes to give you time in the audience if you want to ask some question to panelists. And then we will go to the second section of the book with the presentation of Dominique Masson, and then we will have Renata Mota and Marco Texera, and then finally Joanna Lanius for 5 minutes each for the second section of the book. And I will also allow some time for question if you have some. At the end of the second question. So I can't see. Excellent presentation, very useful insights. So thank you. We will continue with these great words. So Dominique, I leave you the floor.
Thank you, Pascale. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our book launch. So the chapter I'm talking about tells a story. It tells the story of the ways in which the World March of Women has engaged in practices of solidarity building with struggles against extractivism in the Macro Norte region of Peru, starting in Cajamarca in 2011, then in support of the indigenous community of Cañaris, and finally, at the occasion of the march's Meeting of the Americas held in Cajamarca in 2015. This is an ethnographically rich story, thanks to the work of my co-author, Anabel Paulos, and a contribution to knowledge of the practices and politics of solidarity building at the local and not so local scales of a transnational feminist network. This chapter also tells an analytical story that is part of a broader conversation about conceptualizing and analyzing solidarity in transnational feminist movement settings. It recognizes that solidarity is a polysemous, seldom theorized, and unwieldy term. It moves away from classical social movement studies that, as others have remarked, offer little for investigating the construction of solidarities in collective action. And you'll find more details about this in the introduction to the book. It retains from transnational feminist theorizing, especially from the work of Mohanty and of Grewal and Kaplan, the notions that solidarity should be seen first and foremost as a political construction, that solidarity building should be conceived as a practice of making links between struggles, and that asymmetries in power and privilege, as well as coloniality, modernity, and Western universalisms affect attempts at solidarity building. Much of feminist thinking and work on solidarity, though, as Janet has remarked, is strongly normative. That is, it remains concerned with what real or true solidarity should look like. For instance, being critical of modernity, decolonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and the like. This chapter makes an intervention in the field of feminist theorizing about transnational solidarities by arguing that this strong normativity, that is its focus on what should be, places important limits on the analysis of what is, that is, of actual processes of solidarity building in feminist organizing, and in particular of processes that do not partake from the same feminist genealogies. Drawing mostly on critical geography, but retaining key feminist insights, this chapter proposes an intermediate level theoretical framework for accessing and analyzing how solidarity is actually done in transnational feminist networks like the March. The main points of this framework are, first, understanding solidarity building as an organizational praxis. Second, conceptualizing this praxis as involving the active linking together of previously geographically and/or socially distant and disparate place-based struggles, this through the construction of connections between actors, places, and mobilizations. Third, analyzing how such active linking is made by considering three interrelated types of practices of solidarity building: discursive, material, and spatial. Fourth, approaching these practices with a dynamic view as parts of a process that unfolds over time, one that also involves political dynamics and that is shot through with relations of power. Finally, we claim that solidarity building is a political strategy that is shaped by specific organizational goals and political projects, and that this makes a difference as to what solidarities are sought, built, with whom, and how. In this chapter, we attempt to demonstrate the usefulness of this framework by analyzing the involvement of the World March of Women in building solidarities with anti-extractivist struggles in the Macro Norte region of Peru, by highlighting the discursive, material, and spatial practices the March has engaged in, and by linking these practices to its broader Latin American-born popular feminist project of social change. We also highlight the limits to such practices of solidarity building, especially as they are revealed in the March's relation to the anti-mining struggles of the indigenous community of Cañaris, and as they relate to the broader project of the March and its socialist feminist genealogy. We hope you'll have a real pleasure reading and engaging with our work. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I see some questions, but I will take all of them in the second part, at the end of the second part of the presentation. So Renata, I think you are alone to present the chapter, if I'm right?
Yes, thank you, Pascale. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-author, Marc Teixeira, as well. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this project, because it's been a long conversation and we're very glad that the chapter resulted as a result of this conversation. And more than summarizing the chapter, I will actually tell a little bit about how we learned from the process of the book. Because Marco Teixeira and I, we started as social movement scholars, and we are situated in critical agrarian studies. And we were interested in coalitions over food, like food coalitions. And that's how we got to know the Marcha das Margaridas. And this is our case study in the book. The Marcha das Margaridas, or the Days March, is a broad alliance between rural trade unions led by women's organizations within the trade unions and other movements, in particular feminist organizations and rural movements, but also ecological movements. And it has been organized since the year 2000 and taking between 20,000 and 100,000 women to the streets of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. It has taken place periodically, and we were grasping their process of solidarity building. We want to make sense of their solidarity building. Of course, critical agrarian studies were very blind to gender difference, and social movement studies didn't have a very strong conceptualization of solidarity. So we started drawing on feminist theory to understand the Margaridas process of solidarity building. And we relied a lot on the learning with you all in the book. We relied a lot on post-colonial theory, transnational feminisms, and intersectionality. However, when we started to look into what solidarity meant for the Margaridas, we realized that the concept of intersectionality, the analytical grid of intersectionality, expected us to look at particular categories of difference that were not the most relevant ones in the Margaridas process of solidarity building. In particular, the intersection between class, gender, and race were not so prominent. And what actually articulated their solidarity was what we called the rural difference or rurality. And I would argue that the main contribution of our chapter to the debates on solidarity that we are organizing here today is to bring, to call attention to this rurality, to rural difference as a category that informs concrete struggles, not only the Marcha das Margaridas, but we think that other contexts of commodity extractions in the global south and beyond, where the Euromodernist visions of citizenship is very much anchored in the idea of the urban citizen. So the urban-rural difference is very much central to social movement struggles, just to many types of struggles. And the Margaridas have claimed that the rural area, the rural subjects must also be subjects of rights. So they also decenter dominant accounts of citizenship and rights, which are very urban centered, and call attention to that the need to think of rurality as a difference, but also to see diversity within the rural difference. So what we do in the chapter is a twofold analytical use of rurality. We follow the suggestions from the editors to look at connections across different sites of struggles. So we understand rurality as expressing itself very differently according to different contexts, to different biomes, to different relations of nature. And here my timer. And second, we look at rurality as a social category, as part of the construction of the political subject. So rural working women is not just a social, a physical location, a place-based struggle, it's also a social location. And with that, we hope to make this case not just to learn from the Marcha das Margaridas to understand their process of solidarity building, but also to learn with this context of struggle, which is the context of a very high level of violence against environmental activists, against land activists. And I think this can be found in many places of the world today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. So now we can go to Joanna Leines.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually prepared PowerPoint so that I checked myself concerning the time, but maybe that's a nice difference now that you not only see our faces, but also some text. So yeah, so my chapter is called The Cosmopolitan Challenge of Building Border-Crossing Feminist Solidarities. And it is based on committed research that with social movement actors in Peru, which I started in 2012 and which I have been trying to uphold these relations of trust and accountability since then. And the questions my chapter asks are what kinds of difference can be engaged with in cross-border encounters? And how do different kinds of difference emerge and interact in these encounters? And how these different kinds of difference and how they emerge actually shape practices of solidarity. And importantly, understand solidarity not only as a stance towards difference, but also as a mode of connecting different struggles that centrally engages with difference. And the leading question of my chapter and of the research that it is based on is how border crossing solidarities that do not strive to overcome, but to bridge differences can be fostered and are actually fostered in activist practices. And in this chapter, I look at two social movement encounters, and both took place in Peru and were transnational in scope. And both argued that difference should not be overcome, but be engaged with as a valuable research for building counter-hegemonic solidarities. But the kinds of differences that became apparent and that became important in these encounters were very different. And I try to trace why this happened and how it happened. So the first encounter was the 13th Latin American and Caribbean feminist encounter. And it was part of a series of feminist encounters that have been taking place in Latin America since the 1980s. And it's one of the most important spaces for Latin American feminists to meet and to build common ground. And I argue that in this encounter, different was engaged as intersectional difference, and especially the organizers were concerned with how to articulate the inequality that they saw as an inescapable part of difference in a productive way, so that conflicts over difference, over inequality could be turned into dispute and then could contribute to more democratic and more solidary Latin American feminist movements. And the second encounter I analyzed is the 5th Diálogos de Saberes y Movimientos, which was organized by a Peruvian collective called PDTG Tejiendo Saberes. And it's a smaller collective, so the first encounter was attended by about 1,400 women, the second one by about 70 activists. And the diálogos, they engaged difference as pluriversal difference. That means that they took the way people were embedded in different webs of social relations. That's how they imagined it, as the starting point for trying to engage different experiences, different ways of life, different worlds, in a way that underlined effective and emotional solidarity. So my chapter traces the cosmopolitics that ensue when subjects performing different worlds encounter each other. And it focuses very centrally on the politics of translation and negotiation that happen in these encounters. And it sees the encounter as, on the one hand, mediated by colonial logics of difference that hierarchize and binarize difference, and also commonality, but also as inflected by very specific local histories. So in this case, Peruvian histories of how difference was conceived also geographically as difference between coast, highlands, and the Amazon. And it analyzes the discursive, the organizational, and the intersubjective logics that shaped these spaces for encounters, and looked at what kind of effects this had for the possibilities of solidarity. So some of the results, if you want to have more, you are very welcome to read the chapter, is that what was very apparent was that if difference is tied to preconceived categories and to specific bodies, and if the organizers thought they were able to define these categories and identify the people that belong to these categories, the space for encounter shrank, and also the spaces for difference to be articulated, or different kinds of difference to emerge. But if difference is perceived as collective and relational process of identification, and very importantly, not necessarily as intelligible, pluriversal modes of solidarity become possible. So I come back to a quote by Spivak, who says that solidarity in many cases is rather a problem of relation and not a problem of knowledge. And my chapter also very centrally showed that one has to trace these relations, and also how within these relations difference is constituted intersubjectively, but also discursively, and how this is then translated into organizational logics to make sense of the kinds of difference that can be engaged with, and the kinds of solidarities, the modes of solidarities that become possible. So much for me, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So we have a couple of questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So the first question I can put on the table is, I would like to know if there are discussions about the use of woman language in transnational feminist discussion forum. And I guess that some of the answer will be presented during the third part of the lunch. So that is the first question. The second one is, if I summarize it, could activists deal with the normative limitation of feminist solidarity as it has been evoked at the beginning of this event? And the third question is concern food sovereignty, and probably Janet and Dominique. What this entry point reveals and hinder in the research at large, but also in the context of Brazil, where the right-wing government devalorized and fight against gender ideology. So if somebody wants to answer this question, please, you have 1 or 2 minutes to do that. And you can choose the question you want. Somebody?
Maybe I can try to start, and I'll choose, I'll try to link the question about language and the question about reversal solidarity, because I think they are very much intertwined. Because at least for me, my analytical perspective was the one of cosmopolitan. So assuming that potentially there were different worlds performed at these encounters. And this also had very much to do with language. So both encounters were in Spanish, or Spanish was the hegemonic language. But very importantly, there were many people who spoke indigenous languages. And so here the question of translation obviously is one of language and of being certain or being secure in how to talk and how to articulate oneself. But it also obviously has much to do with ways of experiences the world, of performing the world, of understanding the world. And this what became very, very, very apparent, I think, in these encounters, that even though the same words were being used, they meant something completely different. And then power relations basically decided, or the ways the encounters were organized, and who had the power to decide what kinds of understandings became central. This also muchness other ways of understanding specific words. So for example, patriarchy or extractivism or nature. So these were words that were very disputed and had much to do with the practices of the people there. So I think a pluriversal solidarity takes this into account. I mean, we come to this later on when we're talking about, or Natalie talks about controlled equivocation. So it is about, I would say, pluriversal sensitivity for kind of taking a step back and not assuming that how the researcher or those or had those activists kind of in a hegemonic position understand words, understand concepts, understand the world is necessarily the only one present in these relations. And here I stop.
Thanks, Joanna. Somebody else?
I could answer the question of food in Brazil, maybe because that's where I'm doing research on, and it's my topic. Thank you, Andrea, for the question. Actually, we use food politics to entry, like we started to research how food sovereignty become a core agenda within the Marcha das Margaridas agenda. But this is not in opposition to gender, but actually we want to understand what it means to do food politics in a feminist way. And we see the Marcha das Margaridas as a clear feminist movement, but it's a coalition of different types of feminisms in plurals, a plural feminist movement. And not all women on the grassroots base identify themselves as feminists, but food helps them and gender analysis is a major political weapon of political formation, and they do it themselves. Like we learn from the Marcha das Margaridas what it means to be a woman in food production, food preparation, food consumption, all the gender inequalities involved, ranging from economic autonomy, political autonomy, nutritional inequalities within the household. So gender has helped and food has helped a process of gender analysis within the movement and of feminist awareness. So I think, of course, if we look at the current context of political polarization within Brazil and anti-gender discourse from the government, we could think that it's not a good idea to talk about gender and that it would polarize. But I would say that everything is actually right now polarized within Brazil, even food politics. So if we think that food sovereignty or the right to food or even hunger would be not such a political polarized subject, it's all the contrary what we're observing today. Even hunger can be very strong, polarized and instrumentalized in such a context. So I think gender and food offers a very good entry point for analyzing relations of oppression, but also a politics of alternative food and gender relations.
Thank you.
Maybe can I come in just quickly on this as well? So in terms of our study of the World March of Women, I mean, one of the things that we discovered actually was that food sovereignty was a way in which the march built alliances with other mass movements on the left. And that in a certain way, the march, in its initiating that, we think was more interested in alliance building than it was in food in some important ways. So it sought to build an alliance with Via Campesina because it detected a kind of political affinity with its project of mass movement building and against neoliberalism. In the same way, it sought to build alliances with networks and organizations of peasant and indigenous women because of the march's own commitments to popular feminism and its own histories of working with rural women, especially in Brazil. So there was a politics of alliance building underway. And in the process of building alliances, the feminism of the march permeated the other organizations in which it became aligned. So through its concrete enactments of concrete forms of collaboration, it augmented the kind of voices and positionality of women within these mixed gender movements, and also the leadership of women-led organizations in those agrarian movements. So there's a kind of, the transmutation of feminisms that are underway in that process, but that from our point of view of studying the march, what came to light for us was actually the politics of that kind of mass movement building that was driving the whole thing, that it wasn't around food per se, it was the politics of mass movement building. So that was just part of our empirical finding about the march and the kind of feminist politics it was enacting. But what's also interesting in terms of the question about the normativity of feminist solidarities is that, there's not one feminism and there's not one normativity around this, is that feminisms are in movement. And one of the most dynamic ways in which they're in movement is the ways in which they are multiplying and permeating these other mass mixed gender movements, and where feminism is becoming part of the language of political resistance in these movements, such that these movements are recognizing that to be emancipatory movements, they need to attend to gender, and they need to attend to the emancipatory agendas of feminism. Now, there's nothing kind of, what shall I say, this is fraught. Like this doesn't do away with all the debates that one needs to have about different kinds of feminisms and different kinds of normativities, but that there is a politics underway here of the pluralization and permeation of feminism across these different movement fields.
Thank you, Janet. So we will go on with the third section of the book and final words. So first Geneviève Paget, then Nathalie Lebon, and then Manisha Desai will close the presentation. So Geneviève.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for this great discussion. I also want to thank the editors of this book, Janet Conway, Pascale Dufour, and Dominique Masson, for not only producing the book, but also organizing the symposium that allowed us to discuss, to share, and improve our thinking on transnational solidarity building. I start from a saying by Ali Mary Tripp that when looking at transnational feminist movements, it's important to recognize that the influences have always been multi-directional and that the current transnational consensus is a product of parallel feminist movements globally that have learned from one another, but have also often had quite independent trajectories and sources of movement. And to address this, the chapter the chapter where I'm talking about today focuses on the exchange and translation of ideas and concepts across linguistic and cultural barriers. And what I do is I try to document one of the ways in which local feminist movements have learned from and interacted with one another transnationally, thus contributing to the development of transnational solidarity. This chapter thus argues that as social scientists, as well as activists, we need to pay attention to the multiple and conflicting power dynamics ubiquitous in the process of conceptual translation, if we aspire to build a feminist movement critical of its own power imbalances. And so in this chapter, I address the issue of conceptual border crossing, so the crossing of concepts or ideas, mainly from a theoretical perspective. But to illustrate this, I rely on the example of the travel of and the resistance to the concept of intersectionality in Montreal Francophone feminist movement, theorized as a transnational space in and of itself. This case study is particularly interesting to highlight multiple lines of power negotiation. First, the travel of intersectionality is embedded in French-English power relation in Montreal. Coming from the United States, intersectionality is in the integration of intersectionality in the Francophone feminist group has been denounced as participating in US hegemony. Yet because it emerged in Black feminist circles, it's also imbued with resistance to mainstream and dominant US feminist conceptual hegemony, namely its anti-racist critiques. Furthermore, its integration into the mainstream feminist vocabulary has been contested because of the perceived appropriation and depoliticization of the word by white feminists. And so its integration into mainstream Francophone feminist circles in Montreal is subjected to crossing power dynamics tied to language, tied to anti-racist critiques of white feminism, and tied to resistance to an appropriation of Black produced theories to serve white feminists. By paying attention thus to the micropolitics of conceptual translation, this analysis is rooted in the careful study of the making of solidarities, which involves, according to the other chapter in the book, the elaboration in movement discourse of political imaginaries and forms of identification that connect movement actors and their struggles together. So in this sense, the chapter documents one of the types of practices involved in solidarity building, the discursive practices, highlighting that, like any other practice, it is imbued and disfigured by power dynamics. Words and concepts become a battleground for legitimizing or condemning actors, group, or even whole movements. So drawing on translation studies, including the recent work on cultural translation by Alvarez, Costa, and Taylor, I tried to study the importation of politically charged term into a spatially situated transnational movement to highlight the messiness of solidarity building, understanding the state of local theoretical tradition, the different needs needs of groups within a community, the importance of key individual as passers for the information, and the reconfiguration of borders are all elements that we need to pay attention to when we think about the power asymmetries between languages and how they work when we critically evaluate the importation of concepts across borders, considered, of course, borders very metaphorically. As we strive to strengthen transnational ties and solidarity among feminist communities, it's important to critically reflect on the conceptual language we use to define issues, how this language has become meaningful, what might be lost, who gains and who loses in the process. As cultural translation theorists have argued, words are not just symbols of stable meanings, they carry with them political histories inscribed in complex, multi-scalar power relations. So the traveling of concepts not only reflect those complex web of power relation, but they also participate in them by disrupting them and or reproducing them. And so that echoes with a little bit with what Joanna said in her section. So there you go.
Thank you, Geneviève. We can go with Nathalie Lebon now.
Okay, I also want to thank everybody for for having been able to participate in this wonderful experience. So my chapter here draws on Geneviève Paget's work, which she just explained in terms of the key role of conceptual translation for solidarity building. My chapter seeks to elucidate the roots of a serious communication breakdown or failure of translation, which prevented the World March of Women from crafting a unified slogan for its 2015 international action around the concepts of territorio and territoire. This failure of translation, it looks like, okay. This failure of translation is more precisely an equivocation around the indigenous feminist concept of cuerpo territorio. This is a concept which circulates much more widely today. The concept of equivocation was theorized by anthropologist Viveros de Castro, and is when participants from different political cultures believe homonymic concepts refer to the same reality when in fact they do not. And because each context alters the meaning of the concept. But as Brazilian scholar Claudia Lima de Costa writes, equivocation doesn't simply mean a mistake or a misconception, but it is the incapacity to understand that different understandings of different worlds do exist. All right, so the case that I'm looking at now is the difference between territorio, and territoire. So territorio is a concept connected to Zapatismo and other forms of indigenous quest for autonomy. This concept affirms indigenous connections and right to the land and to self-governance denied by colonial powers. It also goes beyond such material notions to include the sense of place and ancestral community bond to the natural world present in Latin American indigenous cosmovisions. On the other hand, territoire, in a French-speaking political context, is a word used by the armed forces, by the right, the word homeland in American English carries a similar connotation. So in the Central American context, defending one's territorio on the part of indigenous and peasant movements is laudable, right? It's coherent with principles of justice and equality. Conversely, in the current context, native-born European or women or descendants of settler communities or settler colonies, if they claim to defend their territory or their homeland, you can see how that smacks of nationalist racism and anti-immigrant discourse. So as a result of this equivocation, the March did not use the concept in their slogan, but this is not the end of our story here. So to control equivocation requires highlighting the opposing connotations of two seemingly identical terms, the connotations that they bring to the table. In the process, according to Viveros de Castro, we get to understand much more deeply how the two cultural contexts are related to each other. In our case, the connection is through opposing experiences of colonialism, right, as people from colonized versus colonizer nations. So next, my chapter analyzes the practices deployed by the march to control this equivocation, as well as the challenges these efforts present when taking into consideration power imbalances between Western mestiza popular feminism and indigenous feminism in Latin America. So it is crucial, obviously, for the desired connotations of a new concept and its original political context to be made explicit. The march, in a later written communication, carefully laid out the context before introducing the concept of defense of our bodies and territories. In what we now understand as a land acknowledgement, they first acknowledged territories were stolen from indigenous people, in this particular case, a non-conceded Mohawk territory, and they also rejected anti-immigration public policies. So in doing so, by laying out this framework first, they control the equivocation for a French-speaking audience. Finally, my chapter digs deeper to find the roots of the equivocation. The fact that indigenous roots of the concept were not explicitly acknowledged originally contributed to the equivocation. Instead, the concept was framed in terms of as coming from the struggles in Guatemala. So coloniality and indigeneity would have needed to be acknowledged as important axes of difference among network participants, but they were not at the time, due to the gender class analytics of the march and ultimately to power differentials between mestiza and indigenous feminisms in the region. So this brings us back to Genevieve's focus on conceptual translation as an exercise in redrawing the border between social movements. In the end, this chapter demonstrates that solidarity building in translocal contexts involves weaving struggles together, not only across difference resulting from geographical distance, but also across difference resulting from differential positionality, including within a given society. That's a framework Sonia Alvarez labels translocation. In the end, I too argue for the benefits of a fully intersectional, translocal, analytical framework in the face of unaligned geographies of difference and differential positionalities in translocal networks. And my apologies for the technical mess up.
That's okay, Natalie, no problem. So we will finish the presentations with Manisha Desai, who kindly accept to write an afterword in the book. And then we will have time for questions to panelists after that. So Manisha?
First of all, I want to congratulate you all. It's an excellent book. And I was asked to talk for 5 minutes on why you should read this book, but I think better than I can say, all of you in your presentations have actually demonstrated much more beautifully than I could why one should need this book. But I'm still going to just say a couple of things, because when Janet and Dominique and Pascale invited me to write this afterward first, I began it in a sort of way in which most of us do, kind of more like doing a critical review of the book. And then they said, no, that's not what we want you to do. We want you to sort of see where it takes you. And so my afterward then began to look at how the book was challenging me to rethink my own work on transnational feminisms. And solidarity, as I think Janet so clearly explained, has been kind of this black box. We all use it normatively, but we don't know what goes in and what comes out. We just expect that somehow it happens. And I think their introduction lays out beautifully not just the genealogy, but the work that we actually need to do to understand solidarity as a praxis. And for me, so one of, the introduction alone is a good reason to read this book, because I think it does an amazing job of, looking at the history of solidarity, things we take for granted, the various ways and different traditions, it's different political genealogies, but then linking it to transnational feminism, which is kind of the work that I do and I'm most familiar with, but also problematizing transnational feminism itself from, the way in which for it, solidarity is normative, but not a praxis. And so I think that the introduction does a wonderful job. And there was a question that I think was it Stephen who asked in the Q&A, that then given that you have rethought of solidarity as this messy praxis, do you then have, what he calls a different conceptualization of solidarity? And I think if I read the book and all the rich contributions correctly, it is to say that solidarity happens in multiple ways. And as a praxis, just as praxis cannot be conceptualized in a unidimensional way, neither can the praxis of solidarity. And so I think, the notion that at least these are three different ways, counter-hegemonic, intersectional feminist, and pluriversal are, I think, one way to think about the multiple ways in which we currently see solidarities in practice in movements that cross all these borders. So that's kind of, I think, one reason to really read this book. But I think the second, and all of you have made this so clear, is the empirical depth and richness of this book and the chapters. I mean, each of you I could sort of, think about the ways in which each really contributes to that introductory framework. And as someone who's done multiple edited volumes, both of books and special issues of journal, it is rare to find that all the chapters actually take and relate to, the theme of the introduction of the book so well, because very often, edited books can be hit or miss in terms of how they talk to the major project. But in this instance, I found each of the chapters really does grapple in so many interesting and different ways with, the large problematic of what is solidarity in praxis, how do movements enact those, what are the messy ways in which we all know the existing inequalities get reproduced no matter what our commitments, political or otherwise. And so in that sense, I think the book is a success also as an edited book, because most edited books don't cohere as well as this one does. And so I think that's another reason to read it. And I think finally, just because I think messy as all these praxis of solidarity are, I think what you see in each of the chapter is the commitment to this kind of liberatory practice that we all want, regardless of the messiness. And for me, as an eternal optimist, because as I tell my students, what is the alternative? Be depressed and, do nothing? Is that, people are engaging with the messiness, people are reflecting and trying to kind of still have a hope for alternative multiple worlds. And so I think that's another reason to read this book. So I really want to, first of all, congratulate you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to engage with this wonderfully rich chapters. And in some ways, rethink, the ways in which I've been thinking about transnational feminism and solidarities, and taking it to, other projects that I'm working on right now. So once again, thanks and congratulations. And I want to leave some time for people to ask other questions.
Thank you very much, Manisha. Before letting people asking questions in the Q&A, I just want to say that I did not present in detail each contributor of the book, but you can find the presentation of each of them at the page 209 in the book and the page following. So if you want to know who is writing in the book, you can just look at the book and see who are the contributors. So if you have some question, please write it down in the Q&A, and perhaps just to beginning, Manisha, you just raised that question, but I have also see that, do we propose a new conceptualization of solidarity or transnational feminist solidarity in the book? So I can see it's a question for all of you, and if yes, what is pluriversal solidarities in this context? So perhaps I can ask panelists just to raise their hands so I can see who wants to talk. Janet, Dominique, Janet, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'll start with a few thoughts, but I'm interested to hear what others think about this notion of a new conceptualization of solidarity. I mean, I really agree with what Manisha said, that I think to me, the book reiterates that solidarity is performative, that it only makes sense in and through the practices and discourses in which it's evoked. And that's what we have to look at. And that it is, so it's only in that performative sense that it's possible to specify what it is. And that it also is one of these, in its very normativity, it evokes bounded political communities, and we always have to examine how that is operating and how it affects exclusions. And so there's a kind of injunction to be constantly reflexive about the practices and discourses of solidarity as they are performed. I think the other thing I want to say is that in our critique or our treatment of transnational feminism here, we're not suggesting that we supersede it. We are putting it out there as an important critical tradition that has helped us think well about solidarity, think in important ways about solidarity, but that, like any tradition, it is also a product of its own time and space and context. And that if nothing else, the book, I think, invites us to be open to new praxis of solidarity as they are taking shape, and to examine them for their lessons and also for their pitfalls and limitations. So it's an open-ended project. And I think, just in closing on that, the World March of Women, is also a particular kind of feminist politics with its own normativities. But one of the things that I find extremely inspiring about the march is that it constantly says to itself that its feminism is a project under construction. It is an open-ended project, and it is constructed through the praxis of the people who engage in the project of the march. And to me, solidarities are that. They are enacted in practice, and it's an open-ended construction, and they always have to be examined for what they are enabling and what they are shutting down. And so that's, on the thought on the conceptualization of solidarity. And then on pluriversal solidarity, to me, the big insight here comes from the Zapatistas, and it has to do with the notion of building a world with space for many worlds. And discourses of solidarity and emancipatory politics in general have been premised on one shared world. And this kind of notion of the pluriverse challenges that and opens that up, and also forces us to grapple with the problems of intelligibility across profoundly different ontologies. And I think it's in indigenous movements more than any others right now that challenge is really being put down and put on the table for people who have come out of modernist ways of thinking about the political, that it compels us to open our imaginations about how we enact politics across difference.
Thanks, Janet. Somebody else from the panelists? Dominique, you want to say something?
Janet says this so beautifully. I'm not sure what I want to add, except to say that what the book is offering is a series of ways to analyze actually occurring processes of solidarity building in their variety, in their messiness, in the ways they're caught up with relations of power, yes, but in the ways they're related to different kinds of political projects, and the pluriverse itself is one of these political projects, right? So it allows us to kind of step back and look at what normativity is telling us and where it comes from and what it's attempting to do, which is the performative aspect of solidarity building. So it's an invitation to not take solidarity for granted, not take the kind of solidarity we favor for granted, and actually analyze what's actually what is occurring.
Yeah. Thank you, Dominique. There's no other question in the Q&A. If who wants to say something? We are not obliged, eh? We can stop here and say goodbye.
Manisha has her hand up.
Okay, Manisha.
I was just going to say a quick, and this is not a comment or a question, but a thought, is I think the biggest challenge in terms of recognizing pluriversal imaginaries is its constant, I guess, struggle with the nation state and the way in which you're organized today. And so when we think about, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, that even as we have these alternative pluriversal imaginaries, in some ways almost like a David and Goliath struggle. And so how do we sort of put those two together? And so it's really just, a thought about, how our thinking and our kind of realpolitik are so incommensurate right now that it, becomes much more of a challenge to think about what would solidarity look like, in the moment if we were to take all of these different ways of. So.
I agree. Renata?
Yes, and I think maybe one contribution from the Masdas Margaridas, when we're talking about feminist solidarities, and considering specific contexts of women's movements from popular feminism, for instance, in Latin America, it's interesting to observe that the political subject as a feminist is not always attractive or consensual in specific contexts, like in Brazil. Just as the question from Andrea Gil, many women don't see themselves as feminists or don't see themselves in a feminist movement, but they identify themselves politically as Margaridas. And then they understand that Margaridas are those who are united in solidarity to fight for women's rights. And then many of them out themselves as feminists. So when we theorize about solidarity, I think even the expectations implied with the feminist solidarities might exclude some rather than include more. And I like to just look at these coalitional identities that have emerged and do not rely on women or feminists, or like on this very strong political. Of course, I'm not trying to. I think it's very important. Like Janet explained, that the feminist alliance, especially the World March of Women, have brought a lot of agendas, and there's a cross-fertilization and the learning from each other in this process. But I think that if we are to analytically understand process of solidarity building, it's important not to start always looking for feminist solidarity.
Thank you. We have a small question. Is there some South-South solidarities studied in the book? If so, what they are the same concept boundaries or other kind of colonialism of solidarity concepts used? And there's a question about also how to purchase the book. Perhaps we can put the link to the editor in the chat, in the Q&A. I don't know if it's possible. And I have another one. Is this Isn't the praxis informing the theory? Can you explain how you reach the conclusion about normativity? And it was about solidarity, the question. And last one, it seems also that the challenge is thinking feminist solidarity in post-pandemic world, especially because of the evidence of the exacerbation of inequalities.
Maybe I can say something quickly about the question about how do we reach the conclusion about normativity in transnational feminist scholarship. Well, as I said, we started with transnational feminist scholarship as our kind of starting point. And all of us had been very steeped in this, in the works of Mohanty, Graywell, and Kaplan, those foundational studies, and then went on to really search out literatures on transnational feminism for help in studying solidarity building and also making sense of the practices of the World March of Women, which was a transnational network that looked a lot like what was being imagined in the early works of transnational feminism published in the 90s. And it was that misfit that we found that troubled us, and that led us to really look with a lot of care at the kind of debates and scholarship that was being produced under the name of transnational feminism. So now Manisha, should also jump in on this, as an expert on this. But what we found is that increasingly the literature on transnational feminism is not that anchored in the practices of feminist movements. And so it's doing a lot of work, but transnational feminism is being used as an analytic that is applied to all kinds of phenomenon, and not necessarily or primarily to activist practices of solidarity building. So we found a kind of lacuna there that made it problematic, made it difficult to use transnational feminism in the way that we had imagined using it. And then in reading its more explicit discussions about solidarity building, this is what we came to, is that really it's telling us what solidarity should look like, but not actually how it is enacted. So that's what led us to our conclusions about that. But Manisha or Dominique should comment, or other contributors should comment on this as well.
Manisha?
Just very briefly, because Zahra is also a friend and colleague who raised that question and does work on transnational feminism as well. But I think particularly as it operates in the US Academy in women's studies, it's really about the questions of what was happening in US women's studies, and not necessarily about transnational feminisms, out there in practice. And I think to some extent, Valentine Moghadam's work tried to do that by actually anchoring it in actual networks and sort of moving it away. And so that's, the second generation of scholars working on transnational feminism who use it more empirically, than Mohanty or Inderpal do. And then I think, of course, you have Leila Fernandez and others, again, kind of, going back towards that. So I think this back and forth in a way, really, I think, again, locating it in its origin within US women's studies and the questions it was addressing for that. And, parallel to what was happening, I think, as Iona mentioned earlier, with, the International Women's Decade and the UN stuff. And, so both of those kind of parallel things happened and informed each other. And I think lead to the lacuna, which I agree, I think, with all of you, that it does demonstrate that there isn't really actually existing analysis or understanding of perceptions of solidarity within transnational feminism. It's more an analytic, or then it's more descriptive or more empirical in terms of studying, but not really understanding. So that's kind of, I think, what I would say.
Thanks, Manisha. Joanna?
One brief answer to the question about South-South solidarities, and whether it was the same boundaries or the same kinds of colonialities observed. Because what I was looking at were these two encounters, which were very much embedded in post-colonial contexts, but in the global South. So in Peru and Latin America, and both were counter-hegemonic in the sense that both were positioned positioned against coloniality, against racism, against sexism. So they were very much conscious of the political conflicts, the negotiations, the positionalities, and very much took a stance of the Global South. But still, what I show in my chapter is that still colonial logics were reproduced in these encounters, even though they very much tried to overcome them, tried to find other ways of relating to each other. So, for example, it was about, I would call it productivism, so the idea that you need to produce results in some way, that very much shaped the hierarchies, shaped the dynamics, and again marginalized, for example, the activists that weren't very familiar with academic concepts, that weren't very familiar with Spanish as their native language, but had other native languages, for example. So, and also the idea of difference as something dichotomous, as something hierarchical. So in that sense, I would say, even in these, what is very interesting, what is very challenging is to trace exactly how these colonial logics are reproduced, even in spaces that are very conscious of colonial logics and coloniality, and try to overcome that. And then this is something that happens also in South-South solidarities, definitely, I would say.
Well, just to say, Ashish Nandi very, I think presciently refers to that as the intimate enemy, right? That coloniality in some ways is, for many people, such an intimate enemy that even as you kind of work against it, you end up reproducing it. So it's just reminded me of South-South doesn't therefore, erase colonial logics, regardless of who the actors involved might be.
Yeah, I think the same we could say about the World March of Women. I mean, it's a transnational network spanning North and South, but it's a heavily Southern-based network with Southern-based leadership, with multiple axes of South-South solidarity. And these issues are everywhere in an anti-imperialist network. Issues about the logics of coloniality and certain, Eurocentric actually Eurocentric imaginations about what emancipation is, including in feminism.
Thanks, Janet. So perhaps it's time to close the lunch. I don't know if Anna, you want to say something?
No, just thanking everybody, and very happy to host the webinar, and congratulations to everybody for the book, and thanks to all the participants.
And you will find the recording of the presentation with the link, Anna, that's it?
Yes, we will be editing the recording and we'll be sending it to you by email.
Super. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice day or nice evening, depending where you are. And I hope to see you soon.
Bye, young person.